So in this video, we're going to go ahead and create the solution for this registration form. So I have a new file. I'm going to save it. I'm just going to call this registration form.html. Use my nice Sublime shortcut and get our boilerplate going. So when we're faced with a project like this, there's quite a few places that we could start. And the first thing that I'm going to do is add the form tag in. And then I'm also going to add this h1 just up top here. And we'll just put register. So let's go ahead and open our registration form here. I'm going to move it over. Okay, not quite there yet, but at least our h1 is looking good. So let's go back to Sublime, and let's start with the simplest thing, which would be this top level of inputs, the first name and last name. So we'll start with input, and those are type equals text. Oops. And let's give it a placeholder, which looks like it should be John. Let's do another one. Placeholder is Smith. And then we need to give two labels. So we could use either syntax for labels. I'm going to use the for, and so we'll call this first, and then we'll make sure we give an ID equal to first. And then this label will say first name colon, which will give us that. And then we need to do the exact same thing. Another label for last. This one will say last name colon. And then we need to give this ID equals last. So let's check in, see what we have. So far, so good. There's one small thing that we're missing, which is we haven't given these inputs a name. So I'll just give it the name first and name last. Great. So let's move on to the next chunk here. Oh, we're actually missing one thing, which is the validations. So while we're here, remember that first name and last name are not supposed to be blank. So in order to do that, it's very simple. We just add the required attribute on the inputs, required, and set that to be true. So I'm going to go ahead and expand this just so that we can see a little bit clearer what we're working on. So the next thing, if we consult the form here, is the gender radio button. So we need to have 3 radio buttons. So those are input, type equals radio, 3 of them. And if we take a look at what that gives us, first thing you'll see is that they are in line with the other elements, which is not actually what the form that I gave you is supposed to look like. So we have a few options to get things to behave. We can throw them in a paragraph, like this, just to add some spacing. Now we get them on a separate line. I'm just going to use a div here. There you go. You can see a div doesn't quite have the same spacing that a paragraph has. In the CSS video, we'll actually talk about what that spacing is. So now we need to go ahead and add our labels. And before we do that, let's actually give them the same name. So name will be gender here. Just go ahead, and I should have used my shortcut here, which is to command click multiple cursors. So we give them name equals gender, and then let's give them each a value. So the first one, the value will be male. Second one will be female. The last one is other. And we refresh. We don't see any of that, of course, because that's just behind the scenes. So what we need to do is add in our labels. So we're going to want 3 labels. First one, we're going to say label for, and we'll just call this male. let's see, did we have colons here? No colons, so just male, and then ID equals male. Same thing, another label here. This one will be female, and then we're going to want to say ID, for equals female, and then we want to say ID equals female. So as you can see, building these forms, it gets a little tedious sometimes when you have a bunch of labels and a lot of nested things. You just have to be extra careful that you have everything corresponding correctly. So we want for other, and then we want to do ID equals other. So let's just check in on this, see what we have. All right, that looks great. We can only select one, which is what we want. Next thing we can move on to, let's go ahead and add the submit button at the end, just while we're here. So that's going to be input type equals submit. And let's just make sure our validation works. Yes, it does. Great, in good shape. So next up, we have an email and a password field, and those are on new line as well. So let's go ahead and add another div, and we're going to do an input. And this time it's type equals email. It's not just text. And the placeholder here was your email, which is admittedly not the best placeholder text, but we're going to stick to the image, make sure we follow the assignment. So input, type is email, placeholder is your email, and then we have another one for password. And that gives us the two inputs. Next up, we can either go with name, so we'll just say name is email here. And remember, in case you're confused, that name is purely used behind the scenes to figure out how to send the data. What should we send the data in the request under? What's the name of it? So in this case, whatever we type in this field is going to be called email. So we won't see an impact. Just in case, I do think this is one of the more confusing parts because it's not very visual. So this one, we'll say name is password. And then let's go ahead and add our labels. So just to mix it up here, I will use the other type of label, which is where we nest the data inside the label itself. So we'll say email colon, rather than the for and ID syntax, they work the same way. Let's do email and password. Let's be very precise. There are colons on both of them. Great. Let's save that. And there is one other thing that we should take a look at. Let's see, our validations are in place. Let's fill this in. No. So one thing that we're missing is we need to require the email. So we need to go to our email and add required. Now we refresh, fill these out, we leave email blank. If we type in a non-valid email, we get this error. Great. So far, everything looks good. We're going to come back to the bonus password validation at the end. Before we get there, let's move on to the birthday select. So 3 drop-down menus. So again, I'm going to add another div. And this time in this div, we're going to add 3 different selects. So 1, 2, 3. Let's start with this first one, which is for month. And let's go ahead and start with the label. There's only one label here for everything. So I'm going to do it like this. Label, and put all 3 selects inside. And this label is going to say birthday. And it's going to look like that. So if we see what we get, we have our 3 inputs, our 3 labels. And all that we need to do is add in the correct data inside. So that's a bunch of options. So the first one, let's go ahead and add, I'm just going to do 2 or 3 here. So this will be for months. So we'll do Jan, Feb, and March. The next one, we'll do the same thing, just a few options. and this will be for day. So we'll start, let's do double digits. So 10, 11, and 12. And the last one will be the year. Let's just do 3 again. And let's do 1999, 2000, 2001. Great. And you can see we get our drop down here. There is one small difference though, which is that ours start right away with January and numbers and the year, but the one that I gave you starts off with month, day, and year. So there's a few ways of doing that. The simplest one is just to make the very first option say month, day, and year. And by doing that, HTML, the form just picks the very first option and it decides that's the initial value. So that's the most common way of doing that. So now our form looks pretty good. We just need our final I agree to terms and conditions checkbox. So we can add yet another div here. And let's indent this properly. Our final div inside of this one, we're going to, let's start with a label. This time, let's do for, and this one, let's call it agreed. I agree to the terms and conditions. And then the next thing that we need is our input type equals checkbox. Let's give it ID equals agreed. And name, we'll also go with agreed. And let's see what we get. Looks good to me. So one thing that we also need to add to our select tags is a name. So let's just call this month. And this one will be day, and this one will be year. And remember that if we didn't want January and Feb and Mar to be what was actually sent through, if we wanted it to be something different, like a number corresponding, we would put a value here. So for Jan, we might put value 1. In this case, I'm fine with just having Jan there. I didn't specify how it needs to behave. So we come back here. It looks pretty good. Everything looks the same. The last thing we really have to discuss is the actual password validation. So I want to just show you how you could go about finding that. So I'm just going to open up HTML length validation. And let's try that. As you can see, I've actually already been here. This is something I had to look up recently. And it looks like, so this is Stack Overflow, by the way, if you haven't seen this before. This allows someone to pose a question. Is there any other attribute in HTML with the help of which I can set minimal length of value for fields? And then people provide answers, and the highest voted answers appear first. So this answer says, you can use the pattern attribute. The required attribute is also needed, otherwise an input field with an empty value will be excluded from the constraint validation. Okay? So it looks like this is all we need. So this is an input, and we give it pattern equals, and this weird looking thing, and then required, and then this title. So before we even ask about what this even does and what this 5,10 does, let's just see. So let's go ahead, find our password, and this is a lot of what being a developer is. It's a lot of copying and pasting some things or finding some code and tweaking it. So we need to make this fit what we have, which is an input name is password, type equals password. So I'm just going to copy these 3 attributes. So now we have type is password, pattern is 5,10, required, and title equals 5 to 10 characters. So let's see what that does. Refresh this. Make sure we have everything else filled out. I click submit, and it tells me, please fill out this field, 5 to 10 characters. I type 2 in, type 3 in, type more than 10, it doesn't work. But if I type 5 or 6, it does work. So let's explore a little bit more. Let's start with this one here. Let's change this to be password must be between 5 and 10 characters. And refresh. Make sure we fill out everything else so we can get this error. And I click submit, and you can see I get that message that we set. Password must be between 5 and 10 characters. So that's what this title is doing. It's basically the error message that is being displayed. So then the other new part is this pattern. And this is admittedly a little weird, but using this syntax, we're just defining the length, a range of the length that is acceptable for this input. So if we change this to be 2 to 3, I submit, still not acceptable. 1 is not acceptable, but 2 is acceptable. So this is just defining a range or a pattern that we need to follow. So there is definitely more to this. You can do other things besides a minimum length or a range of lengths, but that's all I needed you to find here. If you weren't unable to find that, don't panic. It's still very early on, but there are going to be more opportunities for you to attempt things like that. So I do have a full solution that I wrote up, which is complete in that it has the full day and year and month inputs. And you can see it's kind of a mess. I did not write this by hand, and I did not expect you to write this by hand either. So we'll see how to actually generate this later on in the class. You could use JavaScript to do it for you, so you don't actually have to write this all. So take a look at the solution if you have any questions.